This panel will offer a contextual analysis of the vulnerabilities of forcibly displaced people, drawing on lived experiences and voices of forcibly displaced people themselves, and so that their vulnerabilities can be understood and assessed. By addressing the concept of vulnerability, it becomes also necessary to ground definitions within specific macro, meso, and micro level, to uncover the qualitative differences between them. So, Mr. Nezih, you have the floor, and welcome.
Thank you, Giovanni. And hello, everyone. And nice to be the first opener panel of the RAISD. And again, thank you for welcoming us, dear Mayor. And I would like to benefit from what Giovanni just left. Actually, we try to come up with more of a qualitative definitions and, let's say, matrices. So we actually, through the contextual analysis of vulnerabilities of forcibly displaced people in relation to vulnerability profiling and vulnerability context, actually we try to benefit primarily from the lived experiences, and particularly not to talk about the people, and also not to talk for the people, but actually talk with the people. It means that actually we try to benefit, we try to work with the voices of the subject matters themselves, and which are the vulnerable populations. And through those, we try to address vulnerabilities, and we try to benefit, and we try to create from the perspective of vulnerability, sensitiveness, and responsiveness. And that has been actually part of the trainings that we've been through. So actually, as Giovanni said, we try to benefit from some ground definitions besides the lived experiences and voices of those vulnerable populations. So those were macro level, meso level, and micro level contexts. So they would help us to uncover qualitative differences between different countries, different regions. So I think I will first introduce the participants of the panel, then I will do the introduction of what we have been producing. So from Universidad Complutense de Madrid, Ms. Noelia García Castillo, wave to the public, thank you. And we have from CESIE, Ms. Soad Ibrahim, hello. And we have from Helsinki University, Mr. Antti Kivijärvi. Kivi part was okay at least. Okay, all right. Thank you, Antti. And from Menedék, we have Ms. Borbála Benedek. And from our Anadolu University, we have Mr. Tayfun Dalkılıç and Ms. Elif Akçakaya. And from Yarmouk University, distinguished colleagues, Mr. Dr. Anas AlSobeh and Dr. Zayed Hammad. Thank you. So I would like to go through what we try to frame through vulnerability profiling and also vulnerability contexts. So actually, it was our work package 4 within the project. So trying to come up with vulnerability profiling and vulnerability contexts, and at the same time put them in a booklet of how we can actually create a catalog of vulnerability contexts linked to European Union region and also the surrounding regions, let's say Northern Africa, Middle East, and Turkey zone. And so we actually, through the deliverers of the project, and actually aims to understand and define the vulnerability profiling and vulnerability context, we try to come up with definitions, guidelines, those, let's say, mainstreaming and grassrooting maneuvers, and at the same time try to come up with vulnerability context. And I think, in my opinion, my last slide or my last 2 slides will be more, let's say, to the point in terms of context, and also to come up with a catalog of vulnerability context, particularly with the supervision of Helsinki University. So it was our aim actually to come up with definitions, but I have to say that the last point and the first point, they should be together at the same time, that the booklet definition of vulnerability was not enough for us. So we realized that altogether, operational definition of vulnerability profiling, because it required not a static definition, because of evolving context within the world that defines new contexts. So we realized that actually there needs to work with operational definition of vulnerabilities, which means actually defining a concept in terms of how you plan to measure, or in our case, identify the concepts, varying degrees, let's say from the perspective of socio-ecological levels and dimensions. So we understand the process as a very active process, not a static one, but a dynamic. That's why it needs to be very operational. And while we were benefiting from them, so as at the very beginning, Noelia just shared, we benefited from socio-ecological approaches and also benefited from ARU unit, Action Research Units, and also RRI. So we did first-hand data gathering. So we interviewed people in terms of, as I said, to understand, to inquire lived experiences, and at the same time, we wanted to directly to address the voices of the subjects themselves, the vulnerable populations. So again, we went through to understand and to operationalize the definitions. We went through micro level, meso level, and macro level. And at the same time, while we were going through ontological understandings, processes. So at the first part, I mean, when we were defining the operational, when we were coming up with the operational definition of vulnerability context, we realized that they actually have two main parts. One of them was, it was providing a detailed set of questions concerning vulnerabilities. And the second one was providing a kind of analysis of interrelations between each socio-ecological level and dimensions, and I try to explain from different country and region perspectives. So, to understand the different layers and patterns of vulnerability context, vulnerability, we try to draw a kind of a map or a visual diagram that we may call it a matrix of, it was built through a matrix of three main elements. The first one was to understand how the individual appears. It means that it consists nature or characteristics of an individual, of the members, the condition or circumstances, and the existence of functioning coping mechanisms. And the second one, the second context was the different levels of the individual's environment. So it was kind of the conditions that surround the individuals or the groups. And the third one was the context, from the perspective of the context, the area where the individual perceives consciously or subconsciously the experiences the danger, damage, or vulnerability caused by the interconnected individual contexts and the conditions. So maybe you would like to see in a more detailed diagram. That's why I wanted to share this. So the circumstances and dimensions that form the context for vulnerability include these five main, let's say, columns, dimensions, and in between them we see the subdivisions, how actually multiple variables do function when we try to define those contexts. And coming from the definitions, and thanks to the partner Helsinki University, so when we were coming through vulnerability context, in especially, I mean, we, as you can imagine, we were trying to understand the origin of the vulnerable groups, the journey itself, and the host community. So for example, when we consider the vulnerability context in the force route between Middle East and Northern Europe, just as an example, as you see from the operational definition as a dynamic process, we come up with 4 different cases, with 4 different contexts. As I said, this is just an example of the vulnerability context in the force route between Middle East and Europe. And as you may see, so when we actually define vulnerabilities, it's not defined in one single static definition. It comes with multiple active and complex definitions. So actually you see some of the examples of contextual definitions of vulnerability. And the last slide that I told you before, that would be to the point, that, for example, vulnerability context in the Middle East or in Southern Europe or Eastern Europe and Northern Europe would be totally different because of the context that vulnerabilities exist. So actually, we may realize that the people themselves are not vulnerable, but actually the conditions make them clearly vulnerable. So, and actually changes according to the region. So here we are with our partners, thanks to them. We would like to talk more in detail of what country cases we may see, we may benefit, we may exchange in between each other. And thank you again. So my prime questions that I would like to share with you in advance so you can elaborate in your minds while they're bringing their answers is, for example, what does profiling vulnerabilities may mean for us? Why do we profile vulnerabilities? And for example, in our own cases, as coming from the regional experience, examples, for example, what did we in Jordan, in Spain, in Turkey, in Finland, what did we realize in our countries as behalf of vulnerability profiling and vulnerability context? What was unique about our countries? And especially, I think we may call it vulnerability within vulnerability or vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities, because as it has been shared during the presentation of Ruben in the timeline, that we have been going through with the ongoing wars, pandemic, humanitarian crisis just recently appeared. So we came across with new vulnerabilities while the existing vulnerabilities taking place. So can we also name vulnerabilities within new vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities, already existing vulnerabilities? So maybe I would like to give floor to, would it be okay, Noelia, if we start with you? And approximately 5 to 6 minutes each.
Thank you very much, Nezih, for the presentation and the context. Well, in our case, talking about the Spanish case, and from our previous work in the project, for me, vulnerability context means that not only the personal situation of each person, as you have said, the person is not vulnerable, it's the context, the circumstances that make them vulnerable. So not only personal situation, but also the context of the hosting community and the interaction. And something that is very important, a concept that is dynamic and that changes and has to be adapted. Something that we all have learned because of the pandemic, for example, that the circumstances may vary in a very short term. So vulnerability context is a great contribution, because until now what was considered was vulnerable groups that were considered previously to the work. And also vulnerable context can be adapted to other sociocultural contexts, so it is very important. In the Spanish case, for example, we have interviewed 25 forcibly displaced people, experts, and so on, and all the work that has been developed for this vulnerability context has been considered for all the entire process, not only for the tailored attention and inclusion strategies, but also, for example, with a documentary, with the policy recommendations. So it's a key point for our project. And also socio-ecological models, we have talked about them, and were also essential for the adaptation of the project because of the pandemic and different problems we have faced. Talking specifically about the Spanish context, perhaps we could highlight the administrative differences among the same country, in the country of Spain, that make that, in fact, there are different housing communities in the same country. Also, the high unemployment rates that means that all migrant people can and are exposed to labor exploitation in precarious sectors such as agriculture and domestic labor. And that the NGOs that are basic in the Spanish system for asylum seeker are always overloaded, but even more because of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. In fact, nowadays, some representatives or NGOs in Spain has told us that they fear that by prioritizing the asylum processes of Ukrainian people, the problem is that the vulnerability context of other asylum seekers from other countries will worsen even more if no more resources are given to the system. And finally, talking about the vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities, well, when I saw this question, the first thing that came to my mind was because when making the interviews, some of them told me, please, directly ask asylum seekers who are sub-Saharan women, because they have to speak, because they really face different challenges, in addition to the ones that normally have to be faced. For example, the normal ones, difficulties in housing, in labor market, but also physical and sexual violence, a really long transit, a greater migratory grief because of this extreme violence. And then once they arrive to Spain, they face a labor system that is far away from the one that they are used in Africa with informal entrepreneurship. And well, perhaps you don't know, but Spain, we think that is one of the hardest places for entrepreneurship, because of all the bureaucratic and things that have to be done. And with the pandemic, obviously, all vulnerabilities have improved. Greater isolation, a greater digital divide, and everything that was bureaucratic has to be done digital. So very difficult to reach these people and to be heard. The rising unemployment, and so on. So if everybody was thinking that our own vulnerabilities were increasing because of pandemic, imagine the vulnerables among the vulnerables.
Thank you, Noelia. Thank you so much for sharing. Antti, shall we switch to case of Finland?
Okay, thank you, Nezih.
Thank you, Antti.
For sure. I was thinking of starting with by referring to our keynote speaker, Deborah, and her quite inspirational speech just a moment ago. And she said told us about a man who had survived 16 years in a refugee camp, and survived also at least 3 wars or difficult conflicts in the state of Congo. But he could not survive in the US for 7 months. And by this, I would like to kind of like continue the idea about vulnerability, or the notion or the concept of vulnerability, that it's really a contextual matter. And that to me, vulnerability is something that is inherent. It's like universal human condition. We are all in certain situations vulnerable, or we show vulnerabilities. But in some conditions or contexts, they tend to somehow strengthen some people's vulnerabilities. And I guess that this, for Mr. Zayed, if I remember the name correctly, the context, the difficult context in Congo and in the refugee camp was not such a context that would have caused him so great vulnerabilities, but the US context was something different. And I guess this can be somehow made as an analogy to describe the Finnish context as well. And to me, what is particular in the Finnish context is that Finland is located at the very edge of European Union, or actually the fortress Europe, the difficult place to enter for many forcibly displaced people outside European borders. And this means that in Finland it's quite difficult to arrive, to reach, and this means that mostly those people who reach Finland, let's say from Iraq, from Syria, and so on, they are mostly young people, they are mostly physically fit young people, they are mostly male, they are mostly from the middle class backgrounds, because they have to have the financial resources to do the dangerous and really costly trip. That's one thing that defines the Finnish context. And the other thing that defines the Finnish context is the Nordic welfare state, which is quite strong in Finland, in Sweden, in Norway, and so on. And in the slides, the context was described as context of control. And the welfare state is highly a regulated one. And without a residence permit, or permanent residence permit, or citizenship, it's quite difficult to find place in a society such as Finnish society. And there are very limited chances to be included, like in terms of rights and access to services, access to labor market, access to education. And this means that in Finland, for instance, we have had many and still have thousands of asylum-seeking young men who are willing to work, who are willing to educate themselves, who are willing to integrate into the society, but this is not possible for them. And at the same time, they are defined as risks rather than people in need, rather than people suffering from vulnerabilities. And they are highly discriminated against, and their needs are unrecognized. And this is the basic definition of the Finnish context of vulnerability. But as for the other question about the current situation and vulnerabilities within vulnerability, and I would say that the situation in Ukraine has caused huge changes in the Finnish reception systems and in Finnish reception centers, and how Finland as a state is treating migrants and refugees at this stage. And this shows to me no legislation changes have taken place, and no structural changes has taken place in the reception system in Finland. But the political will has changed quite a bit. And this shows to me that it can be mostly about political will to change things in a way that the system is not only about control, but it's mostly about taking care of people, providing them access to labor market, providing them access to the society and its communities. And this is something that we have learned for the past couple of months, and I hope the development will continue after that as well.
Thank you, Antti. And rephrasing what you said is policies or regulations do not change, but according to the context, their interpretation changes, I guess. Thank you. All right. So how about we go a little bit to the east, to Jordan. How about Jordan?
Thank you very much. Okay. First of all, I will start with my colleague in Arabic. I will help and translate. Okay. And to answer the question.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم شكرا للجميع على هذه الدعوة الكريمة.
I will thank you all for this invitation.
قبل 3 سنوات كنت في مبنى الأمم المتحدة.
Before 3 years, I was in United Nations.
كان الحديث عن نفس هذا الموضوع اللي هي الجهات الأكثر ضعفا.
Okay. It was talking about the same topic about the vulnerability groups.
واكتشفت إنه في فجوة كبيرة ما بين الشيء المأمول ما بين الواقع.
There was a big gap between what we expected and what is in real.
والحقيقة إنه هذا المشروع برأيي مشروع RAISD هذا يقرب أو يذلل هذه الفجوة حتى يتم تقديم الشيء بشكل جيد.
This project, RAISD project, is actually came up to close this gap in Jordan actually.
الأردن يعلم الجميع أنه دولة تستقبل لاجئين بشكل مستمر، لاجئين فلسطينيين، لاجئين عراقيين، لاجئين سوريين، والآن في جنسيات أخرى مثل السودانية مثل اليمنية الآن صاروا يأتون للأردن.
Jordan, from long years ago, 1945, accept or receive refugees from different countries, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and other 15 different nationalities in Jordan, actually.
لو كان الأمر في الأردن يتعلق بالإمكانيات فالأردن لا تمتلك إمكانيات لاستقبال اللاجئين ولكن الاستقبال كان ينم عن جانب إنساني بحت.
At the beginning, Jordan started receiving this refugee under the umbrella of humanities. If you're talking about resources, Jordan is a limited country with resources. That's why we put the refugees in vulnerability context.
الأشخاص اللي كانوا يتعرضوا أو الأكثر ضعفاً في حالات أنا كنت أتمنى إنه في وقت يسمحوا لي إني أتكلم عن بعض الحالات اللي إحنا تعاملنا معها بشكل مباشر. الحالات اللي هي العنف والتعذيب والاغتصاب والقتل، هذه الحالات كلها تعاملنا معها بشكل مباشر وكانت فيها قصص مأساوية فيما يتعلق بهؤلاء الأشخاص.
There are many of vulnerability points have been addressed in Jordan or happened in Jordan due to the vulnerability groups actually, such as killing, gender-based violence, as well as the eco-social economical problem.
أحد هذه المخيمات للأسف ما في جهة استطاعت أنها تعترف فيها، وأنا أقصد بذلك مخيم الركبان والحدلات اللي كان موجود بالحدود. لا الأردن اعترفت فيها ولا الأمم المتحدة اعترفت فيها ولا النظام السوري، وكان موجود أكثر من 100,000 شخص تحت العراء، لدرجة أنه إحنا لما كنا نصلهم كنا نجد بعض النساء تلد في الطريق، كنا نجد أشخاص يتوفون لأنه ما في جرعات، ما في يكون عندهم أمراض، وأنا كنت مشرف بشكل مباشر على دفن ما لا يقل عن 50 ل 100 شخص نتيجة انعدام الخدمات الكاملة.
Due to the limited resources and support of refugees, okay, in Jordan, there are many of violence and health problem between refugees. They're pregnant. Women die because they cannot reach out the hospital. Many of the women, they were born in the road, in the cars. Okay. Many of the children cannot going to the schools. Okay. Many of the family, they are going to yearly marriage of their daughters. Okay, because they cannot take care of her or their kids or daughter at home.
هذا السبب له عدة عوامل. العامل الأولاني اللي هو ضعف الموارد المالية الموجودة داخل المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية. السبب الثاني عدم التزام المانحين بتقديم الدعم للأردن. يعني خطة الاستجابة العام الماضي كانت 2 مليار ونصف، الأردن حصل منها فقط خمسة فقط، وباقي الدول أو باقي المانحين لم يوفوا بالتزامه.
Because the limited of funding resources and resources in Jordan, that increases the pressure on the health services in Jordan. In Jordan, they prepare the response plan. Okay, they ask for the 6 billion to the support refugees actually, but they couldn't get fund to help them. Therefore, many of the health problems raising between refugees, especially inside of camps, because we cannot have a complete health services inside of camps to support refugees.
الأردن تحملت أكثر من 10 مليارات دولار لاستضافة اللاجئين، والأردن عندها عجز بالميزانية يفوق 50 مليار دولار.
Okay. Due to the limited resources, now it's that causes the shortage in providing the services to refugees. So it's now it's not easy to to describe the mental and psychological problems that suffer due to the crisis and number of refugees in Jordan that increases the violence and conflicts that make individual unstable mental health, may generate vulnerability if it is not under the supervision of the social rehabilitations program or psychotherapy. So in Jordan, through the interview of the forced displaced persons that carried by the RAISD team, we discovered most of them suffering from the physical and psychological violence related to the war, especially between the Syrian refugees. Almost, let's say, most of them, they have not get or obtained the sufficient and increased means for their recovery in Jordan. And therefore, this physical and psychological discord contribute to their vulnerability.
المرحلة القادمة الآن أنا أتحدث عن الأردن. المفوضية السامية لشؤون اللاجئين برنامج الغذاء العالمي يقدم مساعدات فقط ل 20%، أي أن الأردن مقبل على كارثة إنسانية فيما يتعلق بتقديم الخدمات للاجئين السوريين داخل الأردن.
Now, okay. In Jordan, if we cannot provide the services that for refugees, this will increase the number of vulnerabilities, okay, as well as this will affect on them, and this will lead to the general crisis between refugees and Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the insights. And I would like to go to Borbála.
Okay, thank you very much.
For Hungary.
So I will speak about the refugees and the situation and in Hungary. So in our understanding, vulnerability is rather created in the given context and upon personal characteristics. In Hungary, the legal framework and the welfare system as a context of vulnerability. If we see the legislation on migration in Hungary, we can tell that this is not a favorable system because in the last 5-7 years, all the reception centers except 2 have been closed. All the integration supports have been eliminated. So that leads that lack of the full asylum system in Hungary leaves the applicants and the beneficiaries of international protection without a safety net, and it creates a huge vulnerability context for them. Also, since 2020, it's not even possible to apply for asylum in the territory of Hungary, and the political discourse is strongly anti-migrant. And it also means that the meso and macro level stakeholders can create this vulnerability context. And NGOs have greater responsibilities on supporting refugees. Although this context can change, as we are experiencing now because of the Ukrainian crisis, the government and the public discourse are much more open and welcoming towards the people fleeing Ukraine than they were before, when people came from the Middle East. And about vulnerabilities, in our understanding, this term means that vulnerable contexts can also be created if the service providers and the institutions are not fully aware of the needs, of the specific needs of refugees. So interventions are not made according to their needs. And And also, for example, in Hungary, it's not possible for a refugee to change his or her name, even if it would be really important for his or her own safety. So that can also create a really strong vulnerable context.
Thank you, Borbála. Thank you so much. Especially we are facing and observing a new face for Hungary, I guess. Thank you. So we go to Spain and Ms. Soad Ibrahim, if possible. Italy, I'm sorry. Sorry, totally confused. Sorry. I respect the project leaders. So I got it. And immediately Saad said, no, that's not me.
Good morning, everybody. I am Soad from CESIE. I work in Palermo. And yes, I am a trainer, so I always say that I have a big privilege in my work, that is the possibility to work directly with people, with the vulnerable people we are speaking about. So actually today I decided not to talk to you about the vulnerability in Italy, because I realized that actually it's very, very similar to the other countries, as my colleague said. So there is still a big gap of knowledge about what vulnerable people are. And this puts them, of course, in a situation of imagination, in different contexts, in different levels. I want to tell you a bit about my experience with the vulnerable groups that we worked, me and Giovanni and other trainers from CESIE. Because there was a girl, especially Aisha, that taught to me something that really made me learn something new. She said one day, Soad, you know, my pain is your pain, my joy is your joy. And these projects are really important for us because we finally are given voice to our pain. And you will realize through working with me that there is not different. I'm just in a worse situation than you. But when I'm happy, you are also happy. When I'm sad, you are also sad. And this was a big learning for me. Because I really realized in this experience that the problem is the lack of knowledge that people have towards what we call vulnerable groups. Especially in our case, we worked with women victims of trafficking. That means that they had, of course, a physical vulnerability. Some of them were with their kids, so they had to take care not only for them, but also for their little newborn. And we faced a lot of mental vulnerability. That is something that maybe we don't speak too much about, but they had important mental issues because of the traveling, the trauma, the delivery that was maybe done in a boat or in the street. And of course, they were completely vulnerable in their social life. So, Giovanni, you want to add something more about what we...
Just a couple of words. Mm-hmm. We work in this specific center of women that were related to human trafficking. So the situation was really complex, and as you said, the emotional breakdown was every day. But there is a level of empathy and understanding that if you are able to reach after months, days, and of course you need knowledge and techniques to work with in this field, you recognize that boundaries are outside human beings, but are inside society. And what we have tried to do during our activities through food, dance, music, talking, creativity, was to destroy boundaries and walls in order to speak the same language and to try to understand each other. We are still in contact with this woman. I will not say that we became friends, of course not, but we became people that understand each other and respect each other and can work together. And so our activities was also to create sustainability in the future. So what we have planning immediately after the actions was to keep going and try to find sustainable ground in order to don't let them feel alone. Because the sense of loneliness in our society is one of the worst enemy that we have met during our path.
Thank you, Giovanni. I will just conclude with just saying that our wish when we always work with vulnerable people is really to rise their strength. And this is what I learned personally, how strong they are. And thank you.
Thank you, Saad. Thank you, Giovanni. And the last but not the least, we switch to Turkey. Tayfun and Elif, your turn.
Thank you so much. So about the profiling vulnerabilities part of the question, I guess as all partners and also as the Turkish team, we have seen all throughout the project that vulnerabilities emerge within a context. So to be able to profile vulnerabilities, we need to pay close attention to certain components of like a certain context of a certain territory, I should say. And by different components, we mean basically two main things. One is the socio-ecological levels, and the second is dimensions, meaning that different sources that contribute to the emergence of different types of vulnerabilities, such as economical challenges, health care related challenges, education related challenges, or social structure, beliefs, and so on. So for us, profiling vulnerabilities is basically identifying the interrelationships and interactions between each socio-ecological level and also the dimensions I just talked about, I can say.
And when we talk about context, in particular Turkey, we can say that we have a similarity, we have a main similarity with our partner countries from the Middle East. We have excessive number of refugees. When we say excessive number of refugees, I mean, I'm talking about millions of people. And when it combines with political and economical unrest, it creates vulnerabilities in vulnerabilities. It is answer the second and the last question at the same time, I guess. And when it combines with this political and economical unrest, we can talk about the whole society being vulnerable themselves. And so when we operationalizing the definition of vulnerability context, we also consider these two main things, the host society and the forcibly displaced people. And when we are examining the interrelationships between them. And so the definition is more inclusive because it is also focuses on the vulnerabilities of the whole society. And I would like to add one more thing. And when we operationalizing the vulnerability, we have elastic definition of vulnerability. Then we can define vulnerability in different contexts. And maybe you can go.
Maybe about the vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities part, like maybe we can summarize the situation of Turkey a little bit. The most important things that create certain vulnerabilities in Turkey that we have noticed, basically, as Elif said, excessive number of forcibly displaced people. We have, I guess, more than 4 million at this point. And this also makes the whole society vulnerable, as we said, because it creates discrimination, and there are very limited job opportunities in Turkey, and also, as Elif said, again, like when combined with the political and economical unrest, it basically creates a tension between host community and also forcibly displaced people, making it really hard to ensure the social cohesion, I should say. And the other one is especially affecting women and LGBT community. It's patriarchy, and as we said, political and economical unrest, and also low education level. And because these things should not be considered as separate subjects, the interconnectedness between them creates vulnerabilities. And yeah, that's basically.
Thank you, Tayfun. I will conclude in 20 seconds, and then I will give floor to Giovanni. I think even if during the discussions, possibly maybe you noticed some key phrases that actually we have to, in my opinion, we have to keep question them constantly. For example, one of the last phrases we used, excessive amount of. So it means that, again, the numbers become contextual, because what is acceptable number, what is not acceptable number, what is excessive? I mean, are we talking about an extra load? What is the acceptable load? I mean, those become, again, contextual adjectives. So, but they take place in the documents. Another one is, according to Denzin in U1, Handbook of Qualitative Research, they propose that we do not approach issues like vulnerabilities, especially related with people, not with the term research, but inquiry. Because even they define it as research as a kind of an elitist maneuver, rather than someone is approaching from a higher angle to analyze the populations. So maybe we have to keep, as I said, move with more elastic, more dynamic processes. And I totally agree with Tayfun. The last point is, I think while we are analyzing, while we are working on the vulnerabilities of the vulnerable groups and the vulnerability context, but now within the current timeline, I think vulnerabilities of the host communities, in my opinion, like the country of Jordan, Turkey, and possibly others, became a crucial issue that also brings another issue of vulnerability context, the host community's vulnerabilities. And I thank everyone, and I don't know if I should give floor to listeners, if they have any comments, questions, remarks. That's it. We say bye-bye. Conclude. All right. Thank you.